all you people over here, all you KISS Army cadets, rock and roll aficionados, today I'm gonna look back at Ace Frehley's infamous tryout for KISS and the ad they placed in search of a lead guitarist with flashing balls, and why Bob Kulick failed to pass the audition. So stick around, Cat Stanley Space Demons, coming at ya. Alright, so first let's do a little backstory, our little history lesson. Very briefly, and then we'll get into the guitar audition. So KISS bassist vocalist Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley, guitarist vocalist, both grew up in New York City. Paul was born Stanley Eisen on January 20th, 1952, and raised in Manhattan and later on Queens. And Gene was born Chaim Vitz in Haifa, Israel on August 25th, 1949. He emigrated to the States with his mother. They settled in Brooklyn, New York when he was 8 years old. And by the time both Gene and Paul were teenagers, they had decided they wanted to play music, both having been inspired by seeing the Beatles on Ed Sullivan in February 1964. Now, in the fall of 1970, Paul spent 1 week at Bronx Community College before dropping out. He used his student loan to buy a car so he could pursue his rock and roll dreams full time. Now, he met Gene Simmons through a mutual friend, guitarist Steve Coronel. And despite a somewhat adversarial first meeting, seems Paul found Gene to be arrogant and condescending. Go figure that. Paul decided that Gene was somebody he could work with. They both had similar passion, similar vision, commitment and work ethic toward making it in music, and he thought Gene could be someone he could work with. So along with Steve Cornell, the three of them would go on to form Wicked Lester, and that band would record an album and sign with Epic Records in the summer of 1972. Now, Epic didn't end up liking the album and decided not to release it. Gene would later say that Wicked Lester didn't have a backbone, and he was embarrassed by the record. Paul called it eclectic crap, and Wicked Lester lead guitarist Ron Lejak described the album as the Beach Boys on a bad acid trip. So apparently that record was just a mishmash of a bunch of different styles, really lacked focus and cohesion. And Epic didn't like the album, so they didn't want to release it. Gene and Paul basically disowned it. And after that experience, recording that record with Wicked Lester, Gene and Paul decided to walk away from that project. They wanted to create the band they never saw. They were inspired by glam rock and the theatrics of bands like The Who, and especially Alice Cooper. They didn't know exactly what they wanted to do just yet, but they knew they wanted the band to be more focused with a tougher hard rock sound. So after an ill-fated hitchhiking trip upstate in search of a mythical lead guitarist, they decided to focus on finding a drummer. Now, they met future drummer Peter Criss through an ad he'd placed in the Rolling Stone magazine. The ad read, "Experienced rock drummer looking for an original group to play soft and hard music." So KISS, they rang up the ad. Gene ran them through a series of questions. Would you be willing to wear a dress on stage? Are you fat? Do you have a beard? And they wound up meeting. And then they started to rehearse as a trio, the three of them. And they even played a showcase for Epic Records, who decided after seeing the trio that they were not interested. And they waived any lingering obligations that Gene and Paul might have had from the old Wicked Lester contract. Now, they never envisioned the band to be a power trio, so they decided to place an ad in the Village Voice. In December of 1972, in search of a lead guitarist with flash and ability. Album out shortly. Now, the album out shortly part turned out to be bullshit, but they put that in the ad with the hopes of enticing lead guitarists who might not otherwise answer an ad. But they had an open audition at their rehearsal space, which drew more than 30 aspiring guitarists. It was what Paul Stanley would refer to as a long and mostly fruitless freak show. So Paul Daniel Frehley had seen the Village Voice ad, which according to Kiss lore said, "Guitar wanted with flash and balls." Now, Ace said in his memoir that Gene and Paul have maintained that the Village Voice refused to print the word balls, even though the Village Voice was a progressive publication, which never seemed to have a problem with a little salty language. But Ace had a good feeling about the ad. So he loaded up his 50-watt Marshall amp with 8 10-inch speakers into the trunk of the family's Cadillac, and had his mom give him a lift to the audition at the band's loft at 10 East 23rd Street. Now, in Ace's haste to leave the house before the audition, he had just happened to grab 2 different color sneakers. One was red and one was orange. When Ace noticed it on the way to the audition, he thought it looked kind of cool, kind of rock and roll, so he figured he'd just roll with it. But anyways, as Ace pulled up to the loft at 10 East 23rd Street where they were holding the audition for Kiss lead guitarist, he started to get a case of the jitters. So he ran into a nearby store, got himself a 16-ounce beer, slammed that thing, and he was right back in the zone. Now, it just so happened another guitarist had performed before Ace. His name was Robert Joel Kulick. He was born in Brooklyn, New York, and he was just shy of his 22nd birthday. And it turns out Gene and Paul really liked this guy. But we'll circle back to Bob a little bit later. I want to get into Bob's audition, and we'll talk about him. But as Gene and Paul and Peter were talking to Bob after his audition, in walks this skinny guy, Paul Daniel Frehley, and plugs into the amplifier and just starts playing while they're still talking to Bob. So of course Gene Simmons is pissed. He says,
"Hey, sit down and wait a second, will you?" It was like he didn't even hear me. He just kept playing.
Ace was totally oblivious to what was going on. Either that or he just didn't care.
We excused Bob Kulick and told him that we would call him later. "You better be good," I said, "because 2 notes into it, if you suck, you're out on your ass."
And it's funny because Ace mentioned in his memoir that when he got to the loft, they actually had job applications for the aspiring guitarists to fill out. And Ace said he'd never filled out a job application in his life. So he basically just crumpled the thing up and threw it onto the floor before plugging in and ripping it up.
Here was this troublemaker who couldn't match his sneakers and didn't have the good manners to wait his turn.
They ran through Deuce a couple times and they said, "Hey man, it just fit."
"What's your name?" I said. He said it was Paul Frehley. "Well," I said, "we can't have 2 Pauls in the band." Then he actually turned around and said, "Call me Ace."
And that's the legend of the audition of Ace Frehley in the band Kiss. And it's funny because Ace, who is actually Native American, apparently Peter Criss thought he may have looked Asian because Ace says that he heard on the way out, Peter made a joke about how much he loved Chinese food. And he thought it was directed at Ace, who kind of looks Asian, but he's actually Native American. I want to circle back to Bob Kulick. Much has been said about how much Gene and Paul actually liked Bob, and they were really close to letting him in the band. But Paul and Gene have said that they were really image conscious about the band, and since they wanted to be rock stars, they wanted guys who looked like rock stars. So they had rules: no bald heads, no excess weight, no beards. They wanted guys who looked like rock stars. They have always said that the reason why Bob Kulick didn't make the cut was because he didn't have quite the right image for the band. Now, I'm trying to figure out just what the issue might have been. Now, obviously, if you take a look at this picture of Bob, the dude's a cue ball, man. He's bald as a chrome dome. He's got no hair, which makes me wonder, even though he was just shy of his 22nd birthday, maybe he had a receding hairline thing going on at the time already. Maybe they didn't like. Looking at Bob, I also noticed dude seems to be a diminutive little fella. He looked like he was pretty short. So that may have been an issue with the band, even though, Peter Criss is short relative to the other guys, but, he's a drummer. You can hide him behind a drum kit, put him on a 10-foot drum riser, and the guy looks larger than life. So, he could get away with maybe being a little short. Vinnie Vincent was a pretty short guy, but by that time the band was already established. Maybe it wasn't as big of an issue as it might have been early on. So I'm thinking maybe his height may have been a factor as well. Doing a little research for this, I really had trouble finding out specific reasons as to what the issue was with Bob Kulick's image at the time. But I did find this quote from Gene Simmons in this great book, Kiss Behind the Mask, written by David Leaf and Ken Sharp, the authorized biography of Kiss, where Gene says that Bob was actually a little chubbier at the time and had a beard. So it sounds like maybe weight was an issue. Now, the beard thing, you can always shave off a beard. And as far as losing weight, maybe, they didn't really have time for Bob to enroll in a jazzercise. This predated Richard Simmons sweating to the oldies. So maybe they didn't think they had time for Bob Kulick to get into shape. But that's what Gene said. But I'm suspecting the hairline may have been an issue also. Maybe the height, the combination, everything. Now, as far as musical chops, Bob clearly had the chops. I mean, if you listen to those songs he played on Alive 2, man, on side 4, he plays some blistering stuff on that record. So obviously, I don't think musically it was ever in question for Bob Kulick. It was purely an image thing. And when I think about it, the fact that a guy like Bob Kulick, who would go on to become a producer, he would be a touring guitarist, he would be a session guy. He played with artists as eclectic as Lou Reed, Alice Cooper, Meatloaf, Michael Bolton, and Diana Ross. He actually played on 2 number one hits for Diana Ross. And when you think about guys like that, guys with session chops, that's a completely different animal than guys like Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley, who were primarily songwriters. They played well enough to write songs and do what they did. They didn't have session chops. Or a guy like Ace Frehley, who may have been perfect for Kiss, you couldn't have plugged Ace Frehley into Michael Bolton's band. It just wouldn't have worked, I'm pretty sure. Now, as much as I love Ace, he probably didn't have the chops to just jump on stage with Diana Ross. But a guy like a Bob Kulick, who's got those kind of session chops, I mean, we're talking about a guy, even at the age of 21, what he would have been at that Kiss audition, I imagine the dude already had some serious chops. So the fact that a guy like that would even consider joining a band like Kiss, who at the time was unknown, I think that says as much about the band Kiss as it does about a guy like Bob Kulick, because, a guy like Bob Kulick wouldn't want to join a group of hacks. He wouldn't want to join up with a bunch of guys he thought sucked. Now, that being said, maybe it sounds like Bob was probably overqualified for Kiss when you think about it. Now, it's one thing for a Bob Kulick to play on Alive 2. Back by that time, Kiss was already an established band. Guys like Vinnie Vincent, Bruce Kulick, Eric Singer, session type guys that, those kind of guys, when by the time they joined Kiss, they were jumping on a fast moving freight train. We're not talking about Kiss in the Loft on East 23rd Street, 1972. They didn't even really know what their concept was going to be in terms of their makeup and their stage show. I mean, they had an idea what they wanted to do, but it would be a while before they'd flesh it out. And they hadn't even had their demo recorded at that point. So you're talking about, and that whole bullshit line about album out shortly, it was probably part of the reasons why it would draw a guy like Bob Kulick out to join Kiss. Now, that being said, I've always thought that Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley, and Peter Criss for that matter, are underrated as musicians. Even at that time, the fact that and they certainly improved over the years, Gene and Paul for sure. I mean, you listen to how they played even by the late 70s and particularly into the 80s, how much they improved as musicians. But at that time, says something about them that a guy like Bob Kulick would think enough of them to consider joining their band. Obviously, he didn't get in the band, so maybe an offer was apparently never officially made to him. So who's to know that had they even offered Bob the job, he would have accepted it at that point, at that early stage of the game. Who's to know that? Anyways, so after Bob Kulick failed to pass the audition, he would go on to a long career with some of the artists I mentioned. Wasp, co-wrote and recorded a song for SpongeBob SquarePants, the cartoon show. But there's a great interview Bob Kulick did back in 2019 with a guy named Mitch LaFon, and I'll link to the full interview in the description, but it's a fantastic interview. Bob Kulick had a lot of things to say. He was a Grammy Award-winning producer of Motorhead. Kiss never won any Grammys, by the way. He produced The Game, the theme for the WWE wrestler Triple H. He did play on Alive 2 Side 4, All-American Man, Larger Than Life, Rockin' in the USA. Did the live work on that. And he would go on to play on Paul Stanley's solo record. He worked with Kiss in the 80s. But he said in that interview, the podcast Rock Talk with Mitch LaFon, he had a falling out with Kiss, leading him to being uninvited from the Kiss cruise. Now, he had played on a 2018 Kiss cruise, and his performance was so successful playing some of the songs, the Kiss songs he'd been involved in, songs like Naked City, that he says he was offered to do a record and to do a tour with his brother Bruce Kulick, who you all know later joined Kiss in the 1980s. He was offered to do a Kulick Brothers tour, but apparently Bruce turned the offer down. Now, this actually was a big source of tension between Bob and Bruce Kulick. And he did say that his relationship with his brother Bruce changed after Bruce joined Kiss, citing Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley as being a bad influence. They were a bad influence with regards to how to treat people. He said Bruce was nothing more than a replacement guitarist who was following in his footsteps. And he said in the Mitch LaFon interview that Bruce had been quote unquote kissed and that he still worshiped Gene and Paul. I guess the tension started after that Kiss Cruise performance where Bruce declined doing the Kulick Brothers record and tour. The idea was for them to put a band together and play all those Kiss songs that Bruce and Bob had been involved in. And another thing I found interesting, Paul McCartney came up. They were talking about how Paul McCartney, even at his age in 2019, however old he was, I don't know how old he is. He's in his 70s. They talked about how he was still tuning to E standard. Now, if you're a musician or a guitarist, you understand what E standard is. It's standard tuning. Bob Kulick took a dig at Kiss, saying they were tuned down a full step to D to help them hit the high notes. But in defense of Kiss, Kiss actually started tuning to E flat on the early songs. So technically, they're only tuned down a half step for most of the old songs. They didn't start using standard tuning, I don't think, till the late 70s and then into the 80s. But I thought that was interesting. He took a dig at them for tuning their guitars down. But yeah, fascinating stuff I learned about Bob. I kind of came into this thing wanting to goof on the guy, but man, I was taken aback by the dude's passion for music. Sounds like he really just does it for love. Unlike some people we know, who might be motivated by other things. But he also said that he basically only got paid a flat fee for his work on Alive 2, and that knowing what he knows now, back in 2019, he would have gotten something on paper saying if the record went platinum, he would have gotten paid, like a bonus. But I guess he didn't get anything. When the band sold all those records, he got nothing, aside from the original flat fee they paid him. But it's fascinating stuff, man. Check out the interview. I'll link to it in the description. But Bob Kulick wound up checking out in 2020 in May, just about 6 months after that interview, 7 months after the interview. And at the time, he said he was working on a Christmas album that was going to come out Christmas time 2020, but God rest his soul, he wasn't around to see that happen. But I just wanted to get into this. Hope you guys dug it, and we'll see you next time. Who's here?